And the moral of that story is to, brush more diligently than I might be tempted to. And Jesus is making a similar point. He's saying the purpose of the Ten Commandments is to show us there's always far more dirt in our hearts than we realise. And part of what makes our hearts work the way that they do is that they are naturally adulterous. We turn other people's sexuality into a commodity, into a kind of consumable. And that is the way all of us are. And therefore, if we are going to move forwards in a relationship with God, it will have to be on the basis of his forgiveness and not on the basis of our performance. The message of this verse in Matthew 5 is not, listen, you're all pure, so don't look lustfully because then you won't be pure anymore and you'll have messed everything up. Jesus' message is, this is what your heart is like. And therefore all of us are going to need Jesus' forgiveness in this part of our lives. When it comes to sexuality, all of us are sinners. All of us have adulterous hearts. All of us are going to need to repent. All of us are going to have to say no to certain sexual feelings. All of us are going to need the help of Jesus Christ. So from that point of view, Jesus puts us all in the same boat. Our sexual feelings, I'm sure, will vary from person to person. Our tastes, our temptations, our attractions will vary from person to person. But all of us have adulterous hearts, and all of us need the grace and mercy of Jesus. And it's worth noticing, by the way, that Jesus, in these verses, he's also saying something about the person we're looking at. If Jesus is telling us that looking lustfully at someone is against God's will, against God's command, he's also showing us that being looked at lustfully is a problem to him. Jesus is saying that the person who is being lusted over, the person who is being looked at lustfully, he's saying they have a sexual dignity that matters so much to him that it mustn't be compromised even in the privacy of someone else's mind. So there's something quite dignifying about what Jesus is saying here. When someone misuses your sexuality, whether you're even aware of it or not, it matters to Jesus. It matters to Jesus how someone looks at you, just as it matters to Jesus how you look at somebody else. So this passage shows us that all of us are sexual sinners. None of us is what we're supposed to be in this area of life. Jesus very much levels the playing field. There's no room to kind of look down on other people because of their sexual sin, given what our own hearts are like. We all need Jesus' grace and forgiveness, irrespective of our attractions or orientation or pattern of feelings or whatever it might be. So that's the first passage for us to look at. The second one I want us to think about is in Matthew chapter 19, where Jesus is giving us some very, very significant teaching on marriage. So in Matthew 19 verse 3, we're told that the Pharisees come up to Jesus and they test him by asking, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? That was one of the issues being discussed at the time amongst the various Jewish kind of groupings at that particular period. Can you just divorce your wife for any reason? And Jesus answers with these words, Matthew 19 verses 4-6. Jesus says, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. So notice what Jesus is doing here. He's asked a question about divorce, but he answers by talking about marriage. In other words, Jesus is saying, you're not going to understand divorce unless you understand marriage. But there's something more than that, because Jesus doesn't begin in verse 4 by talking about marriage. Jesus begins in verse 4 by talking about creation, specifically how God has made us male and female. Jesus is referring back there to Genesis 1 verse 27. He says, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? So he's saying you're not going to understand divorce unless you understand marriage, but you're also not going to understand marriage unless you understand gender. So the very first thing Jesus wants people to understand is that God has made us male and female. He doesn't simply say he who created them in the beginning made them male and female. He says those who created them from the beginning made them male and female. Our being created male and female was not just something that was true of us in creation, but has now been totally changed by sin. Now he's saying God continues to make us male and female. That pairing of male and female, that duality of male and female, that is still relevant, that is still in play. Now, interestingly, just to skip ahead a few verses, in verse 12 of the same passage, Jesus refers to some people being born as eunuchs. In other words, some, in this instance, men are born without the capacity to reproduce. They're not born with all the full genitalia that you would expect. So although Jesus is saying we're made as male and female, he is recognizing that sometimes there can be some physical complexity. There can be some physical complications. Some people are born eunuchs, for example. There are some people who are born intersex. There are some people who are born where their physical gender seems ambiguous. But by recognizing that, Jesus doesn't say that that is a third sex. Jesus still maintains we are made male and female. So we need to hold these two truths together. That we're made male and female doesn't mean there's no complexity physically with some people. And that some are born eunuchs doesn't mean there's no such thing as male and female. God has made us male and female, physically, sexually differentiated. And Jesus goes on to say in verse 5, it's because of that we have this thing called marriage. Marriage is predicated on that sexual difference between male and female. So Jesus says, he who created them from the beginning made them male and female and said, therefore, because of this reality, a man leaves his father and mother and holds fast to his wife. Marriage happens because God has made us male and female. God making us male and female doesn't mean that all of us have to be married. Jesus himself wasn't. But Jesus is showing us we can only be married because God has made us male and female. Marriage is predicated on the fact that we are different sexually. And therefore marriage for Jesus here is between a man and a woman. Marriage wouldn't exist without that sexual difference. So this is controversial, obviously, in many, many parts of the world today. But Jesus is defining marriage here as being between a man and a woman. That's a hard thing, perhaps, for some people to hear. But we need to recognise that one of the reasons this is controversial for us is because this has been controversial in every single culture throughout history. Jesus' definition of marriage has always been countercultural in one way or another. In some cultures it's countercultural because Jesus is saying it's one man and one woman rather than one man and multiple women. In some cultures it's controversial because the Bible goes on to say that men are to exercise their being a husband by sacrificially loving their wives and not bullying them or demeaning them. In some parts of the world that's controversial. Where I come from, in the Western world, it's very controversial that Jesus is saying it's a man and a woman rather than two men or two women. But it's never been an easy definition of marriage for any culture. It's always countercultural, as we would expect it to be if in fact Jesus is giving us words that come from heaven itself. But the other thing we need to recognise is that male and female is not arbitrary here. Jesus is not just arbitrarily deciding, well, it's between a man and a woman rather than between two men or two women. Because throughout the whole Bible, the union of a man and a woman in marriage has been uniquely significant. Going right back to the biblical account of creation, we get that account of God making us male and female in Genesis 1. And then in Genesis 2, we're suddenly plunged into this scene in the Garden of Eden where a man and a woman get together. They're literally made for each other.